$15. That was all she had left in this world, and it was not enough. She sat in a crumbling diner on Christmas Eve, watching her 5-year-old twins devour grilled cheese sandwiches she could barely afford, while her own stomach screamed from 2 days without food. She had no home, no husband, no hope. The men who had stolen everything from her were still hunting her down, and she knew it was only a matter of time before they found her. But then the door opened, and the entire diner went silent. Not because of the cold wind, because the most feared Mafia boss in the city had just walked in. He saw the empty plate in front of her. He saw her trembling hands. He saw two little girls clinging to their mother like she was the last safe thing in the world. And when he sat down and heard the names of the men who had destroyed her life, something shifted behind his eyes. He did not order dinner that night. Instead, he made a phone call and began deciding who would not live to see the morning. This is a story about the moment when the most dangerous man in the room became the only one willing to protect the most vulnerable. And it will change the way you think about power, mercy, and what it truly means to be strong. If this story grabs you, hit that subscribe button so you never miss what comes next. I have another powerful story waiting for you tomorrow. And before we begin, drop a comment letting me know where in the world you are tuning in from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now, let us dive in. Juliana Molina had no memory of what it felt like to be safe. Just 6 short months ago, her world had been solid. It existed in a little house on Maple Street, the one with the gently peeling blue shutters and a wooden front porch that always groaned a welcome when you stepped onto it. Her world was a warm bed beside her husband, feeling the rhythm of his breathing in the peaceful darkness. It was a life that was far from perfect, but it was completely and totally hers. Now, she was left with absolutely nothing. No home, no money in the bank, and no husband. All she had were 2 small daughters, who still looked at her with eyes that believed their mother could shield them from anything. She huddled in the corner booth of the old diner, her worn olive-green jacket zipped all the way to her chin. The air inside was thick and warm, making sweat prickle along her hairline, but she could not bring herself to take the coat off. The shirt underneath was worn so thin you could nearly see through it, and it was covered in stains she could not hide. Chloe was a warm weight pressed firmly against her left side, her little hands folded neatly in her lap. Palmer sat to her right, her gaze fixed on the menu Juliana held with fingers that refused to stay still. The girls both wore thin sweaters, once a soft beige but now matted with pills and frayed at the elbows. Their blonde hair was dull and hung without a part. Their faces looked unnaturally pale, and their eyes were far too wide, too alert for children their age. They had already learned the hard lesson of not asking for anything. They understood that when Mama cried, real danger was close by. Juliana's gaze drifted across the menu. The heavy plastic felt slick in her hands, but the letters swam together. Her vision narrowed to a small point as her breathing hitched deep inside her chest. She did the math again and again, desperately trying to force the numbers to work. $15. That was the entirety of her world. She could get 2 grilled cheese sandwiches and carefully split each one for Chloe and Palmer. If she was careful, she might even be able to afford a small milk for each of them. That would probably leave her a single dollar for a tip, maybe 2 if the tax was low. She would not be eating. It had been 2 full days since her last meal. The hunger pangs had faded hours ago, replaced by a deep, persistent ache in her gut. It was a constant, dull throb that she had trained herself to push to the back of her mind. A waitress materialized next to their booth. She was a woman in her late 50s, with strands of gray in the hair she wore pulled into a tight bun, and her eyes held a weariness that suggested nothing could ever surprise her again. The woman pulled a small notepad from the pocket of her apron and clicked her pen open. "What'll it be for you, hun?" Juliana's throat felt like it was closing up. She tried to form a word, but only silence came out. The waitress simply stood there, waiting. Chloe glanced up at her mother with concerned eyes. Palmer's tiny hand reached across the table, her fingers gently touching Juliana's arm. Mama. The sound of her daughter's voice gave her strength. Juliana made herself speak, though her own voice sounded foreign, thin, and brittle. 2 grilled cheese sandwiches, please, and could we have 2 small milks? The waitress wrote the order on her pad, her eyes never leaving the paper. And for you? No, thank you, just for them. For a brief second, the waitress stopped writing. Her gaze lifted, taking in Juliana's pale, exhausted face, the dark, bruised-looking circles under her eyes from so many nights without sleep. She then looked at the twins, their little bodies huddled so close to their mother, like 2 small, terrified birds. For just a moment, a hint of softness flickered in the woman's tired expression, but she offered no words. She just gave a short nod and walked away. Juliana let out a slow, quiet breath, her fingers still clenched around the menu's edge. She placed it back on the table with great care, as if it were made of glass. Chloe pressed in closer. Mama, are we going back to our home tonight? A sharp pain tightened in Juliana's chest. Home. There was no home to go back to. For the last 3 weeks, their world had been a single room in a decaying motel on the forgotten edge of town. It was the sort of establishment where the thin carpet permanently smelled of damp earth and mildew, and the broken heater would clatter and bang all through the night. She had used the very last of her cash, money earned cleaning houses off the books, to pay for 2 more nights. She had no idea what they would do after that. We are going to figure it all out, baby. Juliana whispered the lie, gently brushing a stray piece of hair from Chloe's forehead. We always find a way. But as the words left her mouth, her gaze nervously shifted toward the front door. She wasn't looking with hope, but with a deep, consuming fear. The men who had destroyed her life, the ones who had stood inside her own living room and methodically stripped it of everything valuable while her daughters sobbed, were still out there somewhere. They had made it perfectly clear. They would not stop until she paid the full debt her husband owed. The problem was, she had nothing left that they could possibly take. Her husband, David, had been gone for 6 months. A massive heart attack at only 34 years old. It was sudden, vicious, and absolute. 2 weeks after the funeral, she learned that he had borrowed a large sum of money. He had borrowed it from men who did not use contracts or operate out of banks. They were men who had no interest in hearing about widows or orphans or any kind of tragic story. She had attempted to negotiate with them, pleading for a chance to pay them back in small amounts over time. She promised them she would work tirelessly, sell what little she had left, and do anything they asked. Their refusal was immediate and cold. A debt does not disappear just because a man dies. One of them had told her, his voice completely devoid of any emotion. And we are not in the business of mercy. They seized the house, all of the furniture, David's collection of tools, and even the clothes from his closet. And when Juliana, desperate and broken, asked what would happen if she could not find the money, the man had leaned in very close to her face and smiled a chilling smile. Then we find something else to take. She knew exactly what he was implying, so she fled. She grabbed the twins, stuffed what little cash she had into her pockets, and vanished into the unforgiving city. But she knew, with absolute certainty, that they were still searching for her. She could feel their presence like a constant weight on the back of her neck. It was like seeing shadows dance in her peripheral vision. She could not afford to stay in one place for too long. She could not dare to make a friend. She could not trust a single soul. All she could do was fight to survive for one more day. The diner's front door swung open again. Juliana's head shot up, her entire body tensing like a wire. But it was only an elderly couple, wrapped up in heavy coats and thick scarves, their laughter filling the air as they brushed snowflakes from their shoulders. She let out a shaky breath and stared down at her own hands. They would not stop shaking. Chloe saw it. She slid her own small hand into Juliana's and gave it a gentle squeeze. "It is okay, Mama," she whispered in a tiny voice. A burning sensation filled Juliana's throat. She squeezed her daughter's hand in return, completely unable to form words. Their food came a few minutes later. Two perfectly golden grilled cheese sandwiches, neatly sliced into triangles. Two small cold glasses of milk with colorful straws. The twins' eyes widened with pure delight. The sight felt like a crack forming in Juliana's heart. "Go on, my babies," she murmured. "Please, eat." Chloe and Palmer did not need any more encouragement. They each grabbed a sandwich half with both hands and took huge, enthusiastic bites, melted cheese stretching in long strings from their small fingers. Juliana just watched them, her own vision starting to blur with unshed tears. This was everything she had in the world. This single moment, in this worn-out booth, with these two precious little girls who, against all odds, still believed she could somehow save them. And then the door opened for a third time. A raw gust of freezing air surged through the diner, and in that moment, everything came to a complete halt. The man who had entered was tall with broad shoulders, and he wore a tailored black suit that probably cost more than Juliana had earned in the entire last year. His long, dark hair was combed back from a face that was a collection of sharp angles and cold, unwavering control. Intricate tattoos coiled up from the collar of his shirt. The dark ink was a language of violence and authority. Behind him, 4 other men filed in, moving with a silent, watchful discipline, all of them dressed in black. The diner became profoundly silent. Not a single person spoke. Not a single person moved a muscle. The air was stolen from Juliana's lungs. She recognized this kind of quiet. She had heard it before, standing in her own living room, on the day the men arrived to take away her life. And now, here it was again, on Christmas Eve, with no place left for her to run. One of those men had just found her. Adriano Silva never had to introduce himself. His very presence was an announcement. He stood just inside the doorway, letting the snow melt on the expensive fabric of his suit, while his dark, intense eyes swept across the room with the unhurried precision of a wolf claiming its territory. Following him, his 4 men spread out slightly, forming a subtle protective perimeter. They were not being aggressive or overtly threatening. They were just there. They were silent guardians who knew that their boss never required backup, only an audience. The diner was now so still it felt like a photograph. An old man's fork was frozen halfway to his mouth. A young couple was locked in the middle of their conversation, a coffee mug hanging suspended in the air. Even the weary waitress, who had been about to refill water glasses, stood completely motionless, the pitcher in her hand tilted but no longer pouring. No one dared to look directly at Adriano, but every single person was acutely aware of him. Juliana felt her chest tighten as if a band was squeezing her ribs. Her hand shot out instinctively, covering Chloe's small hand, pinning her daughter's fingers to the surface of the table. Palmer paused with a piece of sandwich in her mouth, her eyes huge and filled with confusion. "Mama," Palmer whispered, her voice muffled. "Shh." Juliana breathed the word so softly it was barely a sound. "Do not move." She was intimately familiar with this silence. She had been forced to live through it before, that terrifying moment when dangerous men step into a room and seem to suck all the oxygen out with them. The moment when the other customers in the diner simply ceased to exist. They dissolved into the background, becoming nothing more than living furniture, insignificant obstacles with faint heartbeats. A cold dread coiled tightly in Juliana's stomach. A frantic prayer started in her mind, a desperate loop of please, not me, not now. Her girls were right beside her. This could not be the place where everything fell apart. Adriano Silva's eyes scanned the room with a slow, deliberate precision. He registered an older couple huddled in a booth, a young family by the drafty window, and a solitary truck driver at the counter staring into his black coffee. His gaze passed over each of them with the same detached evaluation, a quick process of cataloging, assessing, and ultimately dismissing. Then, his attention settled on Juliana. She felt his stare like a physical pressure, a heavy weight pressing down on her. The air left her lungs in a silent rush. For 3 impossibly long seconds, Adriano Silva studied the woman in the faded olive coat, her blonde hair hanging limp around a face etched with deep exhaustion and raw fear. He saw the two little girls clinging to her like frightened chicks seeking shelter beneath a mother bird's damaged wing. He took in the half-finished grilled cheese sandwiches and the 2 small cartons of milk on the table. His eyes noted the conspicuous empty space directly in front of her, where her own plate of food should have been, and something fundamental shifted in his expression. A cold, analytical part of his mind clicked into a new focus. Just as suddenly, he looked away. Relief washed over Juliana so intensely that the room tilted, and she felt dizzy. She gripped the Formica tabletop to keep herself steady, her knuckles turning bone white. Adriano moved further into the diner, his men trailing him at a calculated, respectful distance. He selected a booth situated near the back of the room, not tucked into the darkest corner but positioned perfectly to observe every entrance and every face. One of his men slid into the seat across from him. The other 3 positioned themselves at strategic points, standing silently, not blocking any exits or crowding anyone, just making their powerful presence known. Slowly, cautiously, the diner started to breathe again. Conversations resumed, but now in hushed, nervous whispers. The sound of silverware against ceramic plates seemed unnaturally loud. The waitress began to move once more, her hands trembling just slightly as she cautiously made her way to Adriano's table. Before she could even ask, Adriano spoke. "Coffee." His voice was not loud, just a low and quiet murmur, but it possessed a quality that carried effortlessly through the entire room. "Black," he added. "And get an order for yourself, whatever you are having." He made a small gesture toward the waitress. The young woman blinked, her face a mask of confusion. I am sorry, sir?" "You have not had a break all night," he stated. It was a declaration, not a question. "Order some food for yourself. It is on my bill." The waitress just stared, her mouth opening and closing silently as she tried to process his words. Adriano's impassive expression gave nothing away, but his gaze was absolute. It was not a suggestion. Thank you," she finally managed to stammer, and then she quickly retreated before he could add anything else. Juliana forced her gaze down, away from the man and back to her daughters. Chloe had resumed eating her sandwich, but her motions were robotic and tense. Palmer had forgotten her food entirely, her small hands clutching the bread as she continued to stare at the men in their dark suits. "Palmer," Juliana whispered, her voice barely audible as she gently guided her daughter's attention back to her. "Eat your dinner, sweetie. Everything is going to be okay." But it was not okay. She knew it was a lie, because from his booth on the other side of the diner, Adriano Silva was watching them again. It was not a direct stare, not obvious, but Juliana could feel it like a change in the air pressure. She had cultivated a new set of senses over the last 6 months, a sharp and primal instinct for survival that screamed at her whenever true danger was close. Right now, every single nerve ending in her body was blazing with alarm. She watched him from the very corner of her eye as he lifted his coffee cup. It was black, with no sugar, just as he had specified, and he took a long, measured sip. His eyes were in constant motion, missing nothing. He noticed the exact moment the young couple paid their check and practically ran out the door. He noticed the truck driver stealing a glance at his reflection in the chrome of the counter. He noticed the elderly man lean over to whisper something to his wife, and the way her hand immediately tightened around his. Fear had its own distinct signature in the air, a scent he had learned to recognize from a great distance. But something else held his focus. It was the woman in the olive jacket. She had barely shifted a muscle since his arrival. Her entire body was angled to shield her children from view. Her shoulders were hunched, a subconscious effort to shrink, to become less of a target. And her eyes, those tired and terrified eyes, kept darting not toward him, but toward the front door. They kept flicking toward the glass entrance, as if she was expecting someone else entirely, someone she feared far more. Adriano placed his coffee cup back on the saucer with a quiet click. He recognized that specific kind of fear. It was the look of the hunted, the desperate expression of someone who understood that safety was a temporary illusion. It was the look of a person who knew that at any second, that door could swing open, and their absolute worst nightmare could stride right through it. He relaxed slightly into the vinyl of the booth, his fingers tapping a single, sharp rhythm against the tabletop. It was a subtle, almost invisible signal. One of his men, a powerfully built enforcer named Rico, immediately stepped closer to the table. "Boss?" he murmured. Adriano did not turn to look at him. His intense focus remained locked on Juliana's table across the room. "The woman," he said, his voice low. "In the corner booth. Do you see her?" Rico's gaze followed his. "Yeah, I see her. She looks scared. Everyone in here is scared when you show up, boss." "No," Adriano corrected, his voice dropping even lower, becoming more intense. "She was terrified long before I ever walked in here." Rico remained silent, understanding that he was meant to listen and wait for instructions. Adriano watched as Juliana's hand slipped into her jacket pocket to touch something concealed there. Her fingers wrapped around the object, a quick checking motion to reassure herself that it was still there. It was a nervous, unconscious habit. He had witnessed that same gesture countless times. People who obsessively checked their money did so for one of only two reasons. They were either suffocating under the weight of poverty, or they were drowning in a dangerous debt. Frequently, it was both. "She bought meals only for the children," Adriano observed quietly. "She got nothing for herself." "Maybe she is not hungry," Rico suggested. "She is starving," Adriano stated, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. "Look at her hands. You can see it in her face. That woman has not had a proper meal in days." Rico shifted his stance, a silent question. "You want me to do something?" "No," Adriano cut him off sharply. "Not yet." But his eyes never left her, because Adriano Silva had not constructed his entire empire by ignoring his powerful instincts. And at that moment, every instinct he possessed was screaming that the terrified woman in the corner booth was not simply down on her luck. She was running for her life. And whoever she was running from, they were the kind of people Adriano knew all too well. Juliana could physically sense his eyes on her. She had no idea how she knew, because she was not looking at him and had not looked in his direction since that first, heart-stopping moment their gazes had locked, but she felt his attention all the same. The intensity of his focus was like a physical touch, a heavy hand resting on her shoulder, pinning her in place. Her fingers trembled as she reached out to steady Palmer's milk before her daughter's restless movements could send it spilling across the table. "Careful, baby," she whispered, her voice tight. Chloe had finished her entire sandwich. Now she sat perfectly still, her small hands folded neatly in her lap, her eyelids heavy with an exhaustion she was fighting to keep at bay. Palmer was still eating, but her chewing was slow, drowsy, and mechanical. They desperately needed to sleep. They needed a safe, warm bed, and the feeling of security, all the fundamental things that Juliana was currently unable to provide for them. Her eyes drifted to the check, which the waitress had discreetly placed face down on the edge of the table. Her stomach churned. She did not want to turn it over. She did not want to see the final number that would confirm whether her careful calculations had been correct, or whether she would have to face the ultimate humiliation. The thought of sending food back, of asking them to charge her for just one meal instead of two, of begging for compassion from complete strangers, was a fresh form of torture. Her hand shook as she finally reached for it. "Do not!" The voice materialized directly beside her, low and firm. Juliana's head shot up, her heart slamming against her ribs with painful force. Adriano Silva was standing right next to her booth. His hands were pushed deep into the pockets of his coat, and his face was a mask of unreadable calm. Seeing him this close, he was even more imposing than she had imagined. He was taller, broader, and his very presence seemed to consume all the surrounding space and air. The dark ink of the tattoos covering his neck was intricate and deliberate, the kind of art that was earned, not bought. They were the kind that told a story, a narrative written with both ink and violence. Juliana's mouth suddenly felt as dry as dust. She could not seem to make the words form properly. I am sorry. Do not touch the check, Adriano repeated, his voice quiet but carrying an undeniable weight of command. It did not need to be loud to be powerful. Juliana snatched her hand back as if the paper were scalding hot. I was not, she was rambling, unable to control the panicked flow of words. Chloe and Palmer instinctively pressed themselves even closer to their mother's side. Their small faces were tilted upward, staring at the tall, dark figure looming over them. Chloe's lower lip began to tremble. Palmer's eyes were huge with a mixture of confusion and escalating fear. Adriano's focus shifted from Juliana to the two little girls, and for a fraction of a second, an unidentifiable emotion flickered in his dark eyes before it was gone. Then, his gaze returned to Juliana. Where is your husband? The question struck Juliana with the force of a punch to the gut. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. She closed it, then tried again. He is... Her throat constricted, cutting off the words entirely. Adriano simply waited. He did not ask the question again, nor did he try to rush her response. He just stood there with a profound and unsettling patience, his dark eyes steady and unblinking on her face. Juliana felt hot tears welling up, burning behind her eyelids. She fought to swallow them back, to maintain some semblance of control, but the words finally escaped her, broken and raw. He is gone. An immense silence seemed to envelop their table. He died, she whispered, the words barely audible, spoken to the tabletop 6 months ago. The rest of the diner seemed to recede into a distant blur. The low murmur of other conversations, the clatter of dishes from the kitchen, the soft melody of a Christmas song playing from a small radio somewhere, it all faded into an unimportant background hum. Adriano's stoic expression did not waver, but the muscle in his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. How old are they? He asked, nodding his head toward the twins. 5? Juliana's voice was thin and cracked. They just turned 5. Adriano looked at Chloe and Palmer again, but this time he truly saw them. He saw 2 little girls with their mother's blonde hair and wide, frightened eyes, dressed in sweaters far too thin for the biting winter air. He saw them sitting in a cheap diner on Christmas Eve, with a mother who clearly could not afford her own meal. Deep inside his pockets, his hands, which had been resting loosely, slowly curled into tight, hard fists. What happened to him? Adriano asked, his voice even quieter now, more intimate. A heart attack? Juliana quickly wiped at her eyes with the sleeve of her jacket. The doctors told me it was very sudden, she managed to say. They said he did not suffer. But you did. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact. Juliana's breath hitched in a small, sharp sob. She could only nod, not trusting her voice to speak again. Without asking for permission, Adriano pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. His men maintained their positions at a distance, watching everything but making no move to interfere. Now that he was this close, Juliana could see the details that the diner's dim lighting had previously obscured. There was a thin white scar that cut directly through his left eyebrow. The silver ring he wore on his right hand, the intense way his dark eyes seemed to pierce right through her defenses. Adriano's voice was low but firm when he spoke. Tell me everything that happened after he passed away. It was not a question. It was a command. Juliana's hands clenched together in her lap, a knot of fear and uncertainty. I cannot. It is not something I should speak about. His voice came again, insistent. Tell me. A hidden current of sheer authority in his tone, something that had nothing to do with volume and everything to do with raw power, shattered her resistance. The story began to pour from her. David, my husband, He had to borrow some money. Her voice was so quiet it was almost lost in the diner's hum. It was for a business idea, a delivery truck. He dreamed of starting his own company. He promised it would change our lives, give our girls a chance at a better future. She took a shuddering breath, the memory still raw. He did not go to a bank. He borrowed from certain men. I am familiar with that kind of man, Adriano stated, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. Juliana gave a slow nod, hot tears finally escaping and tracing paths down her cheeks. And after he was gone, they appeared. It was only 2 weeks. I never even knew about the loan. David had never told me anything, and suddenly, they had no sympathy. It meant nothing to them that he was gone. They did not care about Chloe and Palmer, about two little girls who had just lost their father. All they were interested in was their money. Her voice began to climb, a sharp edge of hysteria creeping in. I pleaded with them. I swore to them I would pay it back. I would find a job. I would work 2 jobs, 3 jobs, anything they wanted. I asked if I could make payments over time. I just begged them, please just give me some time. And what was their answer? Juliana's expression collapsed into one of pure agony. They told me that a debt does not get buried with the man who made it. Her voice fell to a fractured, defeated whisper. They said they do not deal in mercy. A muscle tightened violently in Adriano's jaw, a single hard pulse of anger. They took it all, Juliana went on, the words flowing like an unstoppable hemorrhage. They stripped our house bare. The furniture, the television, David's tools from the garage, even his clothes, things that belonged to him, to us, to our family. They took every last thing. And when I asked them what would happen if I still could not pay the remaining amount, one of them. She stopped, her entire body beginning to tremble uncontrollably. Adriano's voice became dangerously soft, a stark contrast to the casual smile on his face. One of them did what? Juliana lifted her head, her gaze meeting Adriano's with haunted, terrified eyes. He smiled just like that, she whispered, and said, then we will have to take something else. And then his eyes moved to my daughters. The entire diner suddenly felt as if the temperature had plunged by 20 degrees. Adriano remained perfectly still, not a single muscle moving, but a profound change occurred in his eyes. They became cold, lethal, and utterly without mercy. Names, he said, his voice a soft command. What? She asked, confused. Give me their names. Juliana's eyes grew wide with panic. I cannot. If they were to find out I spoke to anyone, they will not find out, Adriano assured her, leaning forward just slightly. The names. And before Juliana's mind could process the danger, before her deep-seated survival instincts could scream at her to remain silent for her own safety, she found herself whispering 2 names across the small space that separated them. They were names that were meaningless to her, but they meant the world to Adriano Silva. He recognized them instantly. They belonged to men who moved within his own sphere of influence, men who had forgotten the established rules, men who had just signed their own death warrants. Greor and Tommy, Juliana whispered, her voice barely carrying. Greor, I do not know his family name, but the other one is Tommy. Rudo. The second she uttered the last name, a wave of immediate regret washed over her. Adriano's stoic expression remained unchanged. There was no flicker of recognition, not even the slightest twitch of an eyelid. Yet the very air around him seemed to grow thicker, heavier, charged with a dark and suffocating energy. One of his associates, the man she knew as Rico, adjusted his stance in a nearly imperceptible movement. Another man shared a quick, knowing look with the person beside him. It was a silent conversation, a language Juliana could not comprehend, but could feel deep in her bones. They recognized those names. They visited 3 separate times, Juliana continued, the story now a torrent she was powerless to stop. The first visit was just 2 weeks after the funeral. They were almost polite. They informed me that David owed them $43,000. They demanded the full amount immediately. Her hands were clasped together so forcefully that her knuckles had turned a stark white. I did not have it. There was only $300 in our bank account. David's life insurance policy was delayed for months because of the investigation. I presented them with the bank statements, all of the outstanding bills. I showed them everything. And? Adriano's voice was a model of perfect calm, of absolute control. But Juliana could detect a dangerous vibration beneath the surface, something that made her throat feel tight with fear. They said they would return in 1 week. The next time they came, they brought a large truck with them. Her voice broke on the words. They took our living room couch, our dining room table, the television, and all of David's tools from the garage. He had been so immensely proud of those tools. They even took the girls' bunk beds right, while Chloe and Palmer stood there and watched them. A single tear escaped and slid down her cheek. The third time, they came with legal documents. They said our house was listed as collateral. They claimed David had signed it over to them. I had no idea. He never once mentioned that he had risked our home. Adriano's fingers tapped the table a single time. It was a slow, deliberate motion full of unspoken meaning. How much do you currently owe them? Juliana let out a laugh that was both bitter and completely broken. Everything. They seized the house, but even then, they claimed it was not enough. They said David had borrowed far more than the value of what they had taken. They told me I still owed them. $28,000. Juliana's voice rose with the sheer injustice of it all. For a truck loan. For a vehicle that was repossessed only a week after David died. They took the truck back. They took our house. They took every single thing we ever owned. And after all that, they still insist that I owe them more money. Adriano leaned back in his chair, his gaze intense and unwavering on her face. When was the last time they came? 4 days ago. Juliana's voice dropped to a terrified whisper. They somehow found the motel where we were staying. I have no idea how they did it. I had been so careful. But Tommy knocked on our door at 2 o'clock in the morning. He did not have to threaten me directly. He just stood there and said, "We know where you are now. We will always know where you are." Her entire body was shaking with the memory. I packed all our belongings in 10 minutes. We left that same night. We have been on the move every single day since then, sleeping in the car most nights, finding a shelter when we are lucky. I absolutely cannot let them find us again. Chloe made a tiny, choked sound, a whimper she tried to swallow. Palmer pressed her face tightly against her mother's arm, seeking comfort. Adriano's attention shifted to the two small girls, and for the briefest of moments, a flicker of genuine humanity surfaced in his cold eyes. Then, just as quickly, it was gone, replaced by his usual hardened expression. These men, Adriano began carefully, Greor and Tommy, did they ever mention who they work for? Juliana shook her head. No, they only said they were collecting a debt that was owed to them, that they had every right to it. They do not. The words were spoken so softly that Juliana almost did not hear them. What did you say? Adriano's eyes locked onto hers with a fierce intensity. They do not have that right. Not to your home, not to your husband's possessions, and they certainly as hell do not have the right to terrorize a grieving widow and her young children. Juliana could only stare at him, a confusing mix of disbelief and budding hope swirling in her chest. I do not understand. How can you? Because men of their kind operate under a certain set of rules. Adriano's voice was now cold and precise, like chips of ice. And these two have broken every single one of them. He reached inside his tailored jacket. Juliana flinched back out of pure instinct. He pulled out a fine leather wallet, opened it, and removed several large bills without even looking at them, placing the stack on the table. It was $300. Juliana's eyes widened in shock. I cannot accept this. I cannot take your money. It is not for you, Adriano said, pushing the cash closer to her. It is for them, he explained, nodding his head toward Chloe and Palmer. Buy them proper winter coats, some new clothes, and find a safe place for them to sleep tonight. But I cannot. Adriano calmly picked up the small check the waitress had left. He glanced at the total, $14.76, and then pulled another $50 bill from his wallet. He placed both the check and the 50 on the edge of the table for the waitress to collect. Then, he reached over and gently pushed Juliana's own crumpled $15 bill back towards her. Keep it, he said, his voice gentle. Juliana's hands flew to her mouth as a powerful sob finally broke free. It was a raw, desperate sound, filled with 6 long months of terror, grief, and utter exhaustion. Why? She managed to choke out. Why are you doing this for us? You do not even know who we are. Adriano rose slowly from his seat, buttoning his suit jacket with deliberate, precise movements. Because I know what it feels like to watch your own mother go without food so that you can eat, he said quietly. And I know what kind of men Grior and Tommy are. I know exactly what they represent. He looked down at her, and in that moment, Juliana saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch in her throat. It was not pity. It was a deep and profound understanding. They will not bother you again, Adriano stated as a fact. Juliana's voice was trembling. How? How can you possibly know that? Adriano leaned down, his voice dropping to a low, intimate level that only she could hear. Because men like that are only allowed to survive for as long as I permit them to. A chill ran down Juliana's spine, but it was not from fear. It was from a sudden, shocking realization. She finally understood. She understood what he was, who he was, and what those 2 names truly meant to him. Do not say anything, Adriano said as he straightened up. Just take your daughters and go somewhere safe for the night. Get them warm, get them another meal. And tomorrow, he paused for effect, tomorrow, I will personally ensure that you never have to run from anyone ever again. Before Juliana could even think of a response, Adriano turned and walked toward the diner's entrance. His men immediately fell into a disciplined formation behind him, moving like silent, coordinated shadows in perfect. But his hand stopped just shy of the door handle. Adriano went still. He angled his head, not to look back, but to listen to the quiet diner. He spoke across the room, his voice carrying easily. There is one more thing. Juliana's reply was a breath of sound. Yes. Where will you sleep tonight? The question caught her off guard. I am not sure. I plan to look for the Riverside Motel, about 3 blocks north of here. Adriano's voice was flat, leaving no space for debate. You will go to room 212. It is already paid for. You have it for 1 week, and no one will bother you. I cannot accept that. You can, he insisted. His tone softened, the change so slight it was almost imperceptible. And you will, for your daughters. With that, he finally pushed the door open, stepping out into the swirling snow. For a long moment after he vanished, the diner was completely silent. Then, one by one, conversation started up again. The clinking of forks on plates resumed. The faint Christmas music continued its cheerful tune. But Juliana was frozen in the booth, her gaze locked on the $300 lying on the table beside the $15 he had given back to her outside. Through the ice-laced window, she watched Adriano standing next to a dark, expensive car, his voice a low murmur into a phone. His face was a mask of calm, but his eyes held a promise of absolute retribution. Juliana felt physically unable to move. She sat locked in place in the booth, staring at the cash on the table as if it were an illusion that would disappear if she dared to blink. $300. It was more money than she had held in her own hands since the awful time before David was gone. It was enough to provide food for her girls for many weeks. It was more than enough to change everything. Mama? Chloe's tiny voice broke through her trance, pulling her back to the present moment. Juliana looked down and saw both of her twins gazing up at her, their eyes wide with confusion and lingering fear. Palmer's little hand was still clenched tightly around her arm. Chloe's lower lip began to tremble. "Is that frightening man gone?" Palmer whispered. Juliana opened her mouth to assure them he was, but the word got stuck in her throat. Was he a frightening man? Yes, without a single doubt. He was terrifying. And yet, he had also just provided them with more help and kindness than anyone had offered in the past 6 months. "He is gone now, sweetheart," Juliana finally said, her voice strained. "He is not going to cause us any harm." "Are you certain?" Chloe asked, her voice so small and fragile that it shattered Juliana's heart. Juliana gathered both girls into a tight embrace, burying kisses into the soft hair on top of their heads. "I am absolutely certain." But even as the words left her lips, her own eyes were drawn back to the frosty window. Adriano was still out there, a tall silhouette beside a polished black car, with his phone held firmly to his ear. Even from this distance, and through the distorted glass, she could clearly see the rigid posture of his shoulders, the cold, controlled anger that radiated from his entire being. He was making telephone calls, and Juliana understood with a deep gut instinct that those calls were about Gregor and Tommy. A sudden shiver traced its way down her spine, a chill that was not born from fear, but from something entirely different, something she could not yet give a name to. Hope? No, that was a word far too dangerous to consider. But perhaps, just perhaps, it was possibility. The waitress made her way to their table with a hesitant shuffle, her eyes flicking nervously from Juliana to the pile of money. She carefully picked up the $50 bill and the check, but then she paused. "He is a generous man," she said, her tone cautious, as if she were trying out the feel of the words. Juliana had no idea what to say in response. The waitress's gaze fell to the twins, and then returned to Juliana. A look of deep empathy softened her features. "You know something? Those grilled cheese sandwiches seemed a bit on the small side to me. What do you say I go bring out an order of fries, and maybe some hot chocolate for these two girls?" "I cannot," Juliana began to protest immediately. "It is on the house." The waitress's voice was now firm and resolute. "It is Christmas Eve. No child should be hungry on Christmas Eve." Before Juliana could find the words to argue, the woman had already turned and walked back toward the kitchen. Chloe and Palmer looked at each other, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, their eyes began to shine with genuine excitement. "Hot chocolate?" Palmer breathed, as if the words themselves were a magical spell. "And French fries?" Chloe added in a reverent whisper. Juliana felt the sting of fresh tears threatening to fall again. She blinked them back with fierce determination. "Yes, my babies, hot chocolate and fries." The twins broke into brilliant smiles. They were real smiles, not the terrified, fragile expressions they had been wearing for so many months. And as she looked at them, Juliana felt a painful knot inside her chest finally begin to loosen. When was the very last time she had witnessed them smiling with such pure joy? 10 minutes later, their table was laden with food. A large basket piled high with perfectly golden fries and 2 steaming mugs of hot chocolate, each crowned with a mountain of whipped cream and delicate chocolate shavings. And because the kind waitress apparently could not stop herself, she also brought 3 generous slices of apple pie, still wonderfully warm from the oven. "This is for all of you," the waitress announced with emphasis, placing a clean fork directly in front of Juliana. "And I expect to see that fork being used when I come back to check on you." Juliana just stared down at the slice of pie, her stomach churning with a mixture of overwhelming hunger and a deep, biting guilt. "Mama, you need to eat something," Chloe insisted gently. "The nice lady told you to." "Yes, Mama," Palmer echoed, already happily dipping one of her fries into a small pool of ketchup. "You have to eat." Juliana looked at her daughters, at their faces now flushed with warmth from the diner, their eyes sparkling with delight, their small hands reaching out for food without a single worry about rationing every bite. She picked up the fork. The first mouthful of sweet apple pie was almost agonizing. Her stomach, which had grown accustomed to being empty, seized in protest. But she made herself swallow it, and then she took another bite, and then one more. Chloe and Palmer observed her as she ate, and she could see the profound relief washing over their small faces. "You are not going to disappear now, Mama," Chloe said in a soft, knowing voice. Juliana's hand paused in mid-air on its way to her mouth. "What did you say?" "You are getting lighter all the time," Palmer added. Her tone was completely matter-of-fact. "We were afraid you might just blow away." Juliana's throat constricted, making it impossible to breathe. Oh God, they had seen it. Of course, they had seen it all along. "I am not going anywhere," she whispered with a desperate intensity. "I promise you both, I am right here." The twins seemed satisfied with her answer and nodded before returning their attention to their fries and hot chocolate. But Juliana could not stop the silent tears that now streamed down her cheeks as she continued to eat. Across the diner, near the back wall, a few other customers had been watching the small family's drama unfold. An older woman leaned in close to her husband. "That is the table he stopped at," she whispered to him. "The one with the man in the dark suit," her husband confirmed with a slow nod. "I saw it happen. Why would you think he helped them?" The old man was silent for a long, thoughtful moment. Finally, he spoke. "Because men like him remember exactly what it feels like to be hungry, and that is something they never, ever forget." His wife glanced back at Juliana and the twins, her eyes then moving to the money that was still sitting on the table. "I truly hope she takes it," she murmured quietly. "I hope she does not allow her pride to stand in the way of that help." "She will not," her husband replied with absolute certainty. "She has 2 babies to think about. Pride is not something that can feed babies." Outside in the cold, Adriano finished his call and stood motionless in the gently falling snow, his gaze fixed on nothing at all. Rico approached him with caution. "Boss, what is it?" "Gregor Petro and Tommy Rudo," Adriano stated, his voice completely devoid of emotion. "They have been collecting on debts without any authorization from me. They have been running their own operation on the side, taking a share of money that does not belong to them." Rico's jaw grew tight with anger. How long has this been going on? For at least a year, possibly even longer. Adriano's hands slowly curled into hard, dangerous fists. "They have been specifically targeting widows and single mothers. They go after people who cannot fight back, people who are too scared to know any better." "Jesus Christ, they are using our name to do it," Adriano went on, his voice dropping to a dangerously low pitch. "They are telling these desperate people that they work for me, that these debts are officially sanctioned." Rico's face darkened with fury. "They are dead men walking." "Not quite yet," Adriano corrected him, turning to face him directly. "Before that happens, I want a full accounting of who else is involved. I want to know who has been looking the other way while this happened. I want to know who has been taking payments from them." And then, a smile that was both cold and terrible spread across Adriano's face. "Then, we are going to issue a city-wide reminder about why the rules exist in the first place." Rico gave a single, sharp nod. "What do you want done about the woman, Juliana?" Adriano's gaze shifted back toward the diner's large window. He could see Juliana eating her pie, a slow and deliberate motion, while her daughters laughed over their mugs of hot chocolate. For the first time since he had entered the diner, her shoulders were not hunched over in terror. "She is to be protected," Adriano said, his voice quiet but firm. "I want eyes on her around the clock. I do not care if she is aware of it or not. No one is to touch her. No one gets anywhere near those children." "For how long, boss?" "For as long as it takes to resolve this." Adriano's tone was final. "Until Gregor and Tommy are properly handled, and until every single debt collector in this city understands exactly what happens when you decide to break my rules." Rico hesitated for a brief moment. "Boss, she has children with her. What if this thing blows back on her?" "It will not," Adriano stated, his eyes cold with absolute certainty. Because Gregor and Tommy will not be alive long enough to even think about retaliation. He took out his phone once more and placed another call. The person on the other end answered on the very first ring. "It is me," Adriano said into the phone. "I need you to find everything on Gregor Petro and Tommy Rudo. I want a list of every single debt they have collected, every widow they have threatened, every last dollar they have stolen from people." He paused for a moment. "And I want all of it on my desk by morning." He ended the call and stood silently in the snow, watching as Juliana carefully folded the $300 and secured it inside her jacket pocket. She looked up at that exact moment, her eyes finding his through the frosted glass of the window. For a long, silent beat, they simply stared at each other across the snowy distance. Then, Juliana clearly mouthed two words. "Thank you." Adriano gave her a single, sharp nod in acknowledgement. Then he turned and walked away into the darkness, leaving nothing behind but a trail of fresh footprints in the snow. Juliana pulled her daughters close as they finally stepped out of the diner. The lingering warmth of the good meal was a comforting presence in their small bodies. The snow was falling much more heavily now, covering the sidewalks in a thick blanket of pure white. The colorful Christmas lights from nearby houses blurred behind the falling flakes, looking like soft watercolor paintings. Chloe gripped her mother's hand as tightly as she could. Palmer held on to the small paper bag that the waitress had insisted on giving Juliana. Inside was the leftover apple pie, wrapped with care. "For your breakfast tomorrow. Tomorrow." The word itself felt strange and unfamiliar on her tongue. For the past 6 months, Juliana had only been able to think in terms of the next few hours, where the next meal would come from, the next safe place to hide from the cold. But now, with $300 tucked securely in her pocket and a paid-for hotel room waiting for them just 3 blocks to the north, the idea of a tomorrow felt almost real. She pulled the collar of her jacket tighter around her neck and began to walk. The street was mostly deserted and quiet. Most families were already inside their homes, gathered together around their Christmas trees, opening presents and singing carols. Juliana fought to keep her mind from wandering to what that feeling was like. She fought to not remember the last Christmas, when David was still alive, when their house was warm and filled with laughter, and presents were piled high under the tree. "Stop it," she commanded herself silently. "Just keep on walking." They had made it nearly 2 blocks before Juliana suddenly felt it. A distinct and unnerving sensation of being watched. Her pace faltered. Her grip on Chloe's small hand tightened out of pure instinct. She risked a quick glance over her shoulder. There was nothing there. Only empty, snow-dusted sidewalks and the quiet swirl of falling flakes. But the unsettling feeling refused to go away. She began walking faster, her eyes darting everywhere, scanning every deep shadow, every parked vehicle, every darkened apartment doorway. "Mama," Chloe's voice was a small, worried whisper. "What is wrong?" "Nothing is wrong, my baby. We are almost there." But her heart was pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. They rounded the corner onto Riverside Avenue, and Juliana's eyes immediately found the inn. It was a modest 2-story building with a glowing red neon sign that announced vacancy. A wave of profound relief washed over her. Almost safe. Just a few more yards to go. And then she heard it. The distinct sound of a car door opening somewhere behind them. Juliana froze in place. Her blood felt like it had turned to ice as she heard the deliberate crunch of footsteps in the fresh snow. They were heavy, they were purposeful, and they were getting closer. No, not now. Please, not when we are so close to safety. She spun around, instinctively pulling Chloe and Palmer behind her small frame, preparing herself to run, to scream, to fight with whatever strength she had left. A tall man stepped out of the darkness and into the dim glow of a nearby streetlight. The man was dressed in a long black coat, his skin dark, and he was built with the kind of power that could shatter a person without much effort. Juliana knew who he was instantly. He was one of Adriano's inner circle. "Mrs. Molina," his voice was surprisingly calm, perfectly even. "My name is Rico. I work for Mr. Silva." Juliana's breathing became rapid and shallow. "What is it that you want?" Rico slowly raised both of his hands, palms open, showing her he was not armed. "Mr. Silva has asked me to ensure you and your children get to the inn without any trouble." "He what?" "You are being watched," Rico stated plainly. "But not by our people, by them." By. A cold dread settled in the pit of Juliana's stomach. Gregor and Tommy. Rico's expression grew harder. "Not them directly, but they have men out there. They have eyes on every street. Mr. Silva wants to be certain that none of them get anywhere close to you or your daughters." Juliana's gaze shifted past Rico to the large black sedan that was now idling silently at the curb. Its windows were heavily tinted, and its engine hummed with a low, powerful purr. "How long have you been following us?" she managed to whisper. "Since the moment you left the diner," Rico's tone held no apology. "And we are going to continue following you until this entire situation is handled." Juliana was trapped between two overwhelming feelings: stark terror and profound relief. She started to ask about him, but the question died on her lips. She could not bring herself to form the words, to ask what violent plans Adriana was now setting into motion. It seemed Rico understood her unspoken fear anyway. "Mr. Silva handles his own affairs. That is the only thing you need to be concerned with." He nodded his head toward the entrance of the inn. "You should go inside. Your room is 212. Everything has been taken care of for you. In the morning, someone will be posted outside your door. You will not see this person, but they will be there." "For how much time?" "For as long as is necessary." Juliana could only stare at him, her mind struggling to catch up with the speed of events. "What reason does he have for this?" "We mean absolutely nothing to him." "You made him remember something," Rico said, his voice dropping to a quiet tone. "Something he works very hard to push away." Before Juliana had a chance to question what that meant, Rico gave a single final nod and returned to the black sedan. The vehicle pulled away from the curb without a sound, vanishing into the swirling snow of the night. Juliana remained on the sidewalk, her two daughters clutching her sides, as she watched the red taillights completely disappear. "Mommy," Palmer said, pulling on the fabric of her coat, "can we please go in now? I am getting very cold." Juliana glanced down at her two girls, at their exhausted little faces, and the unwavering hope in their eyes, and she made up her mind. "Of course, my sweet girl," she whispered back. "Let's get you inside." Room 212 was not large, but it was immaculate. It held two double beds covered in thick, warm comforters, a private bathroom with steaming hot water, a radiator that actually radiated heat, and a television fastened to the wall. For Juliana, it was more magnificent than any palace. Chloe and Palmer made a straight line for the beds and began bouncing on them, testing the springs, their laughter echoing bright and pure in the small space. "Mommy, you have to feel how soft this is." Juliana paused in the doorway, a lump of emotion tightening her throat. How long had it been since they last slept in actual beds? Was it weeks, or had it already been months? She pushed the door closed behind her, securing every lock. She turned the deadbolt until it clicked, slid the chain into its slot, checking everything. Afterward, she moved toward the window and carefully drew the curtain back a tiny bit. The street below was deserted and silent, yet she understood they were down there somewhere, the men Adriano sent to watch, to guard them. And somewhere else in this city, Adriano himself was on the phone, arranging the pieces on a game board Juliana could not comprehend, carrying out actions she knew she was better off not knowing. He was doing all of this for her, and for Chloe and Palmer. She let the heavy curtain drop back into its place. Within an hour, both of her girls were sound asleep, nestled together in a single bed, their small forms finally at ease, finally secure. Juliana sat on the very edge of the other bed, her gaze fixed on the $300 laid out on the nightstand. It was real currency, which meant real security, which meant real hope. But that hope was a gift from a man who thrived in a world of brutality and intimidation. A man who could erase people from existence with just one phone call. Juliana was fully aware that she should be horrified, that she should gather her daughters this very second and flee as far as she possibly could. She did not move, however, because for the first time in 6 long months, Chloe and Palmer were sleeping without a trace of fear. For the first time in 6 months, Juliana was not straining to hear footsteps approaching in the hall or glancing over her shoulder every 5 seconds. For the first time in 6 months, they were genuinely safe. That safety, however, had a cost that Adriano Silva was paying for in blood. Most likely. Juliana shut her eyes, whispering into the stillness of the hotel room. I am so sorry. She was sorry for whatever was about to unfold. Sorry for the brutal acts she felt were inevitable. Sorry that her own desperation had summoned a man like Adriano Silva into their lives. But she was not sorry enough to leave, because her daughters were finally sleeping, and that peace was worth more than her own conscience. On the other side of the city, inside a warehouse that reeked of engine oil and damp concrete, Adriano Silva stood before two men who were bound tightly to chairs, Gregor Petro and Tommy Rudo. They had been ridiculously easy to locate, far too easy. They were careless men, men who operated under the delusion that they were invincible. Adriano circled them at a deliberate pace, the sound of his shoes echoing in the vast, empty building. $43,000, he stated, his voice calm. That was the figure you gave Juliana Molina, the amount her deceased husband supposedly owed you. One of Gregor's eyes was already swelling shut. Tommy's nose was clearly broken. Neither of the men said a word. Now, this is the part I find interesting, Adriano went on, his tone almost conversational. I had it looked into. David Molina originally borrowed $8,000. The truck you took from them was valued at $12,000. The house you seized was worth $90,000. He came to a halt directly in front of the two men. So, according to my calculations, you did not simply collect on a loan. You robbed a grieving widow and her children, and then you had the nerve to claim she still owed you more. Tommy coughed and spat a glob of blood onto the concrete. You were operating without my permission, Adriano continued for him, using my reputation. You were menacing women and children. He leaned forward, bringing his face down to the same level as Tommy's. You violated the code, Adriano said with a soft intensity. And that code exists for a purpose. Gregor finally found his voice, a desperate plea. Silva, please. We had no idea she was under your protection. Adriano stood up straight. She is now, he declared. And so is every other widow that you have ever threatened. He took out his phone and made a quick call. Bring me the files, he commanded. A few seconds later, Rico walked in, holding a very thick manila folder. Adriano took it from him and opened it. Inside were page after page of names, addresses, and the amounts that had been collected. They were all widows, all single mothers, every single one a victim of the greed of Gregor and Tommy. You are going to repay every last dollar, Adriano announced, plus interest. And then a smile touched his lips. It was not a pleasant smile at all. After that, we are going to have a very serious discussion about consequences. The warehouse grew completely quiet, the only sound being the soft hiss of snow landing on the metal roof. And far away, in a warm hotel room, Juliana Molina slept without interruption for the first time in half a year. The first light of morning filtered through the gap in the hotel curtains, casting a soft, golden glow. Juliana woke up slowly, disoriented for a second about her surroundings. Then she registered the softness under her. A proper mattress, clean bed sheets, warmth, and the memory of the diner flooded back. Adriano Silva, the $300, room 212. She sat up with care, trying not to disturb the twins. Chloe and Palmer were still asleep in the other bed, their faces serene, their breathing deep and rhythmic. They had not woken up even once during the entire night. There had been no nightmares, no crying out, no trembling in their slumber. A tightness of profound emotion gripped Juliana's chest. She rose from the bed without a sound and crossed to the window, pulling the curtain aside just enough to peer outside. The street was peaceful. A couple of cars drove by. A man was walking his dog. Everything appeared perfectly normal, but Juliana knew the truth now. Somewhere down there, Adriano's people were watching over them, keeping them safe. She let the curtain drop and moved toward the bathroom. A long, hot shower. How long had it been since she last had a hot shower? 20 minutes later, she came out feeling renewed, almost human again. Her hair felt clean, her skin was warm, and the knots in her muscles had finally started to unwind. She found some clean clothes in her bag, which were wrinkled but still wearable, and she dressed in the quiet room. The twins were beginning to stir, their little bodies stretching and their eyes blinking in the morning light. "Mama." Chloe's voice was thick with sleep and soft. "I am right here, sweetie." Palmer pushed herself up, her eyes wide with confusion as she looked around. "Where are we?" "We are somewhere safe," Juliana told her, perching on the edge of their bed. "Somewhere warm." She guided them through washing up and getting dressed, her hands moving with a familiar motherly instinct. Her mind, however, was in another place. What exactly happened last night? What did Adriano do to those men? She forced the questions from her mind. It was better not to know. She could not afford to know. A sudden knock at the door made her entire body go rigid. Chloe and Palmer fell silent at once, their small frames tensing up with fear. Juliana's heart pounded against her ribs as she walked to the door. She pressed her eye to the peephole. Rico was standing there in the hallway, holding a large paper bag and a cardboard carrier for drinks. Juliana let out a shaky breath and opened the door, but she kept the security chain fastened. "Mrs. Molina," Rico said, his voice polite and formal. "Mr. Silva wanted me to bring you and the girls some breakfast." He lifted the bag slightly. The rich aroma of fresh coffee and warm, sweet pastries wafted through the opening. Juliana's stomach rumbled, a complete betrayal. She was speechless and could only manage a quiet word of thanks. Rico placed the grocery bags just outside the open doorway. He added something else on top. He set a thick, beige envelope right on the bag of food. Juliana just stared at it, her mind blank. "What is that for?" "It is information," Rico stated plainly, "and it also contains instructions for you. Mr. Silva will explain all the details personally when he gets here." Juliana's eyes went wide with a fresh wave of fear. "He is on his way and will arrive in approximately 1 hour." Rico's face gave nothing away. "He wants to have a conversation with you." Before Juliana could even form a question, Rico had already turned and was walking away down the long corridor. Juliana stood frozen until he vanished completely around the far corner. Only then did she move, quickly pulling the bag, the drinks, and the mysterious envelope inside her room. She slammed the door shut and threw the deadbolt. Both Chloe and Palmer were watching her with huge, questioning eyes. "Who was that man?" Palmer finally asked. "He is a friend," Juliana answered, because she had no other word for what he was. "He was kind enough to bring us some breakfast." At that, the twin girls' expressions brightened with pure delight. Inside the bag, they discovered warm croissants, plastic cups filled with fresh fruit, single-serving yogurts, and small cartons of orange juice. It was real food, wonderful food. They all sat together and ate on the edge of one of the beds. The television played cartoons at a low volume in the background, filling the silence. Chloe and Palmer were chattering with excitement about the cartoons, the incredible softness of the hotel beds, and how wonderfully warm the room felt. It was a normal conversation, the kind of innocent talk that belonged to childhood. Juliana felt the sting of tears in her eyes again, but she forced them back down. After they had eaten every last bite, she reached for the large manila envelope, her hands shaking. It was filled with official-looking papers, legal forms. The very first page made her forget how to breathe. It was a debt cancellation notice. This document hereby certifies that any and all outstanding debts formerly attributed to David Molina, who is deceased, are now declared completely null and void. Absolutely no further attempts at collection will be initiated against Juliana Molina or her dependent children. The document was signed by Adriano Silva on behalf of Silva Enterprises. Juliana's hands trembled violently as she leafed through the rest of the pages. There were bank statements detailing the original loan of $8,000. She saw receipts for their repossessed truck, which was valued at $12,000, and then the legal documentation of their home being seized, which was valued at $90,000. The final page was a stark calculation. It clearly showed that Gregor and Tommy had not only recovered the full amount of the original debt, but had actually made a profit of nearly $60,000 from her family's tragedy. At the very bottom of the page, a message was written in perfect, neat handwriting. It said, "You did not owe them anything. You were the one who was robbed. This situation has been corrected." Juliana pressed a hand hard against her mouth, desperately trying to stifle a sob that tore through her chest. Almost exactly 1 hour later, another knock came at the door. Juliana had been waiting for it, but her body still tensed and her hands trembled as she reached for the handle. Adriano Silva was standing there in the hallway. He was wearing a different suit, a charcoal gray one this time, tailored to perfection. He appeared just as he had the previous night, immensely powerful, utterly in control, and radiating danger. Yet, there was something different about his eyes. They seemed softer, almost weary. "Mrs. Molina," he said, his voice low. "May I please come in?" Juliana looked over her shoulder at her twin daughters, who were absorbed in their cartoons. She then gave a small nod and moved aside to let him pass. Adriano stepped inside, and his commanding presence seemed to shrink the already small room. He looked over at Chloe and Palmer, and for a brief moment, an unreadable emotion crossed his face, something that looked almost like tenderness. "Girls," he began, his voice surprisingly gentle, "how would you like to keep watching your shows for just a little while longer? Your mother and I have some things we need to discuss." The twins glanced toward Juliana for permission, and she nodded her approval. Adriano patiently waited until their attention was back on the television before he turned to give Juliana his full focus. "You have reviewed the documents. It was a statement, not a query." Juliana could only nod, feeling as if her voice was trapped in her throat. "In that case, you understand that you are now free," Adriano continued. "The debt has been erased from existence. Gregor and Tommy will not trouble you or your children ever again." "What did you do to them?" The words tumbled out of her mouth before she could stop them. Adriano's calm expression did not shift in the slightest. "I simply corrected an error they made." "Did you have them killed?" "No." His answer was toneless and final. "However, I did ensure they fully comprehend the consequences of their choices. They will now spend their time repaying every single widow they have ever stolen from, and they will do so with significant interest. And if they should ever consider stepping out of line again." He let the sentence hang in the air. He did not need to complete it. The threat was perfectly clear. Juliana swallowed against a dry throat. "Why are you doing all of this for us? You have no obligation to help me." Adriano remained silent for a long, heavy moment. Finally, he spoke. "When I was just 7 years old, my mother became a widow. My father was killed during a terrible construction accident. Not long after, men showed up at our door, men who claimed my father owed them a great deal of money. They took absolutely everything we owned, from our furniture right down to the food in our kitchen. They would have taken our home too, if my mother had not—" He paused, his jaw clenching with a distant memory. "She was forced to do things that no mother should ever have to do just to keep a roof over our heads. On that day, I made a solemn vow that if I ever gained any power, I would never allow that same horror to happen to another woman or to another child." Juliana's throat felt raw. "So, is this your way of finding redemption?" "No." Adriano's voice was firm and resolute. This is a correction. Men like Gregor and Tommy are able to exist only because other people refuse to stop them. They exist because good people choose to look the other way. I do not look away. He reached inside his suit jacket and produced a simple business card. If anyone ever threatens you again, no matter who it is, you will call that number. It does not matter if it is day or night. Someone will come to help you. Juliana accepted the card with a hand that shook uncontrollably. I cannot, she stammered. I cannot be in debt to you. I cannot owe anyone again. You owe me nothing, Adriano interrupted her, his tone leaving no room for argument. A mother who is protecting her children is never a liability. It is the single most important job in the entire world. His gaze locked with hers, intense and completely steady. You are not a charity case, Mrs. Molina. You are not a debt on a ledger. You are a person who deserves to live a life free from constant fear. And I am a person who possesses the power to make that a reality for you. Juliana could feel the hot tears finally breaking free, streaming down her cheeks. I do not know how I can ever thank you. Do not thank me, Adriano said quietly. Simply take good care of your daughters. Give them the wonderful life that they deserve. That will be all the thanks I could ever require. He moved toward the door but stopped with his hand on the knob. This room has been paid for the next 2 weeks. After that time, there is an apartment that is waiting for you. The first and last month's rent have been covered. It is located in a very safe neighborhood. There are excellent schools nearby. Juliana's breath hitched in her throat. I cannot accept that. You can, Adriano said, looking back at her one last time. And you will. You will do it for them. And then, he was gone. Juliana remained standing in the center of the hotel room, her fingers clutching the small business card, as if it were a lifeline. Tears poured silently down her face. From behind her, Chloe's small voice asked, Mama, why are you crying? Juliana turned around and gathered both of her girls into a tight, desperate hug. Because we are safe now, she whispered into their hair. We are finally, truly safe. 2 whole days had gone by since Adriano Silva had walked out of room 212. It had been 2 days of Juliana waking from a peaceful sleep in a real bed, of feeding her daughters 3 real meals a day, and of watching them laugh without constantly scanning the room for threats. It was 2 days of letting herself slowly believe that perhaps, just maybe, the relentless nightmare had actually come to an end. She was standing at the window now, looking down as Chloe and Palmer played in the small courtyard area behind the inn. Fresh snow had fallen during the night, and the twins were busy constructing a very crooked snowman. The sound of their joy carried all the way up to their second-floor window. It was genuine laughter, the kind of pure, carefree sound that only comes from children who feel completely protected and secure. Juliana leaned forward and pressed her forehead against the cool glass of the window, her warm breath creating a small cloud of fog. She never laid eyes on Adriano after that first morning, but his presence was a constant shadow. His men were always there, new faces each day, maintaining a respectful distance. They watched from across the street or from unmarked cars. They never got close and never uttered a word, existing only on the edges of her new reality, like silent, ever-present sentinels. Any other time, it would have felt like a violation of her privacy. But now, it felt like taking a full, deep breath after months of suffocation. A sharp knock on the door broke her concentration. Juliana's entire body went rigid, a response carved into her by months of terror. Fear was a difficult habit to break. She cautiously peered through the peephole and saw Rico standing there. Taking a steadying breath, she unlocked the door. He held up a small set of keys. Mrs. Molina, the apartment is prepared. Juliana just stared at the metal in his hand, as if it were a venomous snake. So soon? Mr. Silva does not believe in wasting time, Rico stated. his face a mask of professional calm. The apartment is furnished. The utilities are active. The refrigerator is full of food. We have provided bunk beds and toys for the girls' room. A lump formed in Juliana's throat. He had considered every single detail. He always does, Rico confirmed, placing the keys firmly into her palm. The new address is on the key tag. Whenever you are prepared to leave, a man will be sent to assist with your belongings. I have no belongings, Juliana confessed, her voice barely a whisper. Everything I still own in this world can fit inside a single bag. A muscle in Rico's jaw clenched for just a second, the only sign of his reaction. In that case, he replied smoothly, someone will come to help you carry your bag. He pivoted to depart, but then stopped. Mrs. Molina, there was something else Mr. Silva instructed me to tell you. What was it? She asked. He told me to remind you that his protection is not an act of charity. It is a correction of an injustice. Rico's gaze was direct and serious. You were not at fault for what happened. You are not taking advantage of his kindness. You are simply receiving the care and safety you should have been given all along. Before Juliana could find the words to reply, he had turned and walked away. She remained in the open doorway, the sharp edges of the keys pressing into her skin, and was surprised to find that tears were once again streaming down her face. They relocated to the new apartment later that same afternoon. It was on the third floor of a meticulously kept building, located in a neighborhood Juliana had only ever seen from a car window. It was the kind of place where leafy trees formed a canopy over the streets and children played freely on the sidewalks. The sidewalks were clean, and the holiday decorations still hanging on some homes looked incredibly expensive. It was the sort of place where someone like her never belonged. But now, somehow, she did. Rico effortlessly carried her one duffel bag up the 3 flights of stairs, while Juliana carefully guided Chloe and Palmer, one by each hand. The moment he unlocked the door and swung it inward, both of the twins let out a collective gasp of pure wonder. The apartment was lovely. It was not lavish or overly grand, but it was filled with an undeniable warmth. There was a living room with a plush, comfortable couch and a television. The kitchen featured a large refrigerator that hummed a quiet, peaceful tune. It had 2 bedrooms. One contained a double bed with a matching dresser, while the other was a child's dream, with bright pink bunk beds and a large toy chest that was overflowing with brand new dolls and soft, stuffed animals. Chloe and Palmer immediately bolted to their new room, their squeals of sheer happiness echoing through the space. Juliana, however, was frozen in the entryway, completely overwhelmed. "This is far too much," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. Rico placed her bag on the floor next to the couch. Mr. Silva would disagree with that assessment. "But I cannot accept all this." "You can." Rico's voice was firm, yet it held a current of gentleness. "And you will. You will accept it because those little girls deserve to feel stable and secure, and you, Mrs. Molina, deserve to have some peace in your life." He started toward the door, but paused one last time. "There is one final thing." He pointed to a small, discreet security panel installed on the wall near the entrance. "This panel is linked directly to our private network. If you ever, for any reason, feel unsafe, or if anything at all happens, you push this button. Someone will arrive at your door in less than 3 minutes." Juliana stared at the small electronic box, her eyes wide. You are monitoring the apartment at all times?" Rico's expression did not change. It was completely matter of fact. "Mr. Silva protects what belongs to him. And now, you belong to him." With those final words, he departed, pulling the door closed with a soft click behind him. Juliana stood alone in the center of her new living room. She could hear the pure, joyful laughter of her daughters coming from the other room, and she felt the crushing weight of the last 6 months finally begin to lift from her shoulders, piece by piece. That evening, long after the twins had fallen fast asleep in their cozy new bunk beds, Juliana sat on the edge of her own bed. She took out the simple business card Adriano had pressed into her hand. It held only a single phone number. There was no name, no company logo, just the digits that represented a lifeline. She traced the raised, embossed numbers with her thumb, her thoughts consumed by the man who had provided it. He was a known criminal, a man who dealt in violence, a name that could make powerful men fall silent with dread. Despite all of that, he had been her savior. He had done it not because he wanted something from her, and not because he was looking for gratitude or unending loyalty. He did it because he carried the memory of watching his own mother suffer in the same way. Juliana shut her eyes, the image of her daughters sleeping safely in the next room filling her mind. "Thank you," she whispered into the silent apartment. The two words felt ridiculously small and inadequate, but they were the only words she had. Miles away, in a high-rise office with a commanding view of the city's dark streets, Adriano Silva was surrounded by paperwork. His desk was covered in files. There were thick files on Gregor and Tommy, detailed files on every last rogue debt collector that had been working in his territory, and heartbreaking files on all the widows and single mothers they had tormented, stolen from, and utterly broken. He had been awake, working without pause, for 48 hours straight. Rico came into the room without knocking. "She is settled. The children are happy. There have been no issues." Adriano gave a single sharp nod, his eyes still fixed on the documents before him. "And what about the others?" Rico inquired with caution. "The other collectors are being dealt with," Adriano said, his voice as cold as ice. "Every widow will receive full restitution for what was taken from her. Every single illegal debt is being erased from the books. Every man who is a part of this gets one choice. They can make things right, or they can disappear. Some of them will not make the wise choice," Rico noted. "I am counting on it." Adriano finally lifted his head, and his eyes were as hard and unforgiving as granite. "That is their problem to solve, not mine." Rico waited a moment. "Boss, what you are doing for Juliana, it is more than just a simple correction of an injustice. You are aware of that, aren't you?" Adriano remained silent for a long time, his gaze distant. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and heavy with memory. "When I was just a boy, I had to watch my mother plead with men exactly like Gregor and Tommy. She begged them for mercy. I watched her cry every night. I watched her spirit break into a million pieces, and I was completely powerless to do anything to stop it from happening." His hands on the desk slowly tightened into hard fists. "I made a promise to myself back then. I swore I would never be that powerless again. I swore that if I ever gained the strength to stop men like that, I would do it, no matter the personal cost. And Juliana, she reminded me of exactly why I made that promise all those years ago." Adriano's voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of an unbreakable vow. "She is not a charity case. She is not a debt to be collected. She is the living proof that my promise still means something." Rico nodded, understanding dawning on his face. "The men are starting to ask questions. They want to know why you are protecting this widow. They are wondering what she is to you." "Let them ask their questions," Adriano replied, his eyes turning cold once more. "And if any one of them has an issue with my decisions, they are welcome to bring that issue to me in person." But no one would dare. They all knew much better than to challenge him. Rico started to leave, but he stopped at the door. "For what it is worth, boss, I believe you did the right thing here." Adriano offered no response. He simply turned his attention back to the mountain of files, preparing to work through the remainder of the night. He would not stop until every woman that Gregor and Tommy had ruined was made whole again. He believed that power without a clear purpose was nothing more than simple cruelty. And Adriano Silva refused to be a cruel man, not to the people who were unable to fight for themselves, not to mothers who were only trying to protect their children, and especially not to women who reminded him of the one person he had tragically failed to save, his own mother, who had died when he was only 15 years old. She died afraid, in debt, and completely broken. He had been unable to save her, but he could save Juliana. He had to believe that would be enough. Spring finally came to the city, arriving with a tentative softness that painted the streets in hues of new green and delicate pink. Juliana was standing at the window of her sun-drenched little apartment. She watched as Chloe and Palmer played a game of hopscotch on the clean sidewalk down below. The sound of their laughter, so bright and free from any burden, drifted up to her through the open window like beautiful music. Even now, she found it difficult to believe this was her life. 3 full months had gone by since that terrifying Christmas Eve. That meant 3 months of uninterrupted safety, 3 months of breathing slowly and steadily, without fear. The apartment was a gift from Adriano, but it truly felt like it was hers. It was a modest place, just 2 bedrooms on a peaceful street, but it was spotless, warm, and above all else, it was their own safe haven. The small security panel next to the door glowed with a constant, soft green light. It was a silent promise of protection that, over time, had transformed from a source of anxiety into a genuine comfort. Juliana had also managed to find a job. It was not the kind of under-the-table cleaning work she used to do, but a legitimate job with a real paycheck at a flower shop just 2 blocks from her home. Mrs. Gable, the kind, elderly woman who owned the shop, had taken a single look at Juliana's gentle hands and her exhausted but resolute eyes, and had offered her the position right away. "You have the look of a person who truly understands how precious and fragile beautiful things can be," she had told her. The twins had also begun attending the local school. On their very first day, they had clung desperately to Juliana's legs, their small faces white with an anxiety that was born from being forced to flee in the middle of the night too many times. By that afternoon, however, they came back home clutching drawings made on construction paper and telling stories about their wonderful new teacher, a woman named Miss Amy. Now their days were filled with chatter about new friends and homework assignments. Their world was finally growing far beyond the 4 walls of terror that had been their prison for so very long. It was a normal life. It was a precious, ordinary life, and its entire foundation was built upon a quiet, invisible shield of protection. Juliana never saw Adriano himself, but she felt his influence in the unwavering stability of her days. Rico would appear once every month, always on a Tuesday morning, to hand her an envelope. It never contained cash. Inside, she would find a gift card for the grocery store, a receipt for a prepaid utility bill, or a voucher for new children's clothing. "Mr. Silva's various investments generate dividends," Rico would always explain in his usual flat, professional tone. "He insists that they should be shared with you." In the beginning, Juliana had tried her best to refuse the help. "I cannot continue to take this from him. I have a job of my own now." Rico had only looked at her, his expression completely unreadable. "The original debt was never your responsibility, Mrs. Molina. This is not a form of repayment. Consider it a restoration of what was unjustly taken. Please, let him do this for you." And so, she did. With every week that passed, the tight, painful knot of terror that lived in her chest loosened just a little bit more. One evening, while she was sitting on the couch helping Palmer practice her reading, a news story flickered to life on the television in the background. A well-dressed anchor spoke in serious tones about a major restructuring happening within certain unnamed business communities, as well as a new crackdown on illegal predatory lending practices. The report was deliberately vague and only cited anonymous sources, but it did mention that several notable individuals had suddenly departed the city. Juliana's hand, which had been resting on Palmer's book, went completely still. She did not know why, but she knew. She knew she needed to remember their names, Gregor and Tommy. Later that evening, as she was tucking her girls into bed, Chloe looked up at her, her wide blue eyes full of seriousness. "Mama, is that scary man still watching out for us?" Juliana gently smoothed her daughter's blonde hair away from her face. "He is not scary, my sweet girl. Not to us. Is he an angel?" The question made Juliana's throat feel tight. No, sweetheart, he is not an angel. He is just a man who knows what it feels like when other people are cruel. And he made a choice to make it stop. That night, long after her twins had drifted off to sleep, Juliana retrieved the simple business card that Adriano had given her. She had never called the number, but she kept the card inside her small jewelry box. It had become a kind of talisman, a symbol of the night her world had split into two distinct parts, the terrible time before and the hopeful time after. She thought about him then, not as the fearsome mafia boss who could command silence with a single glance, but as the little boy he must have been once. A small boy who was forced to watch his mother shatter under pressure. A man who had constructed an entire kingdom built on fear, only to use its formidable walls to give shelter to a stranger and her children, protecting them from a vicious storm. It was a contradiction so profound that she could not make sense of it, and so she had finally stopped trying. Not all debts are recorded in ink on a ledger. Some accounts are settled in the profound quiet of a safe house, marked paid by the sound of children breathing easy in their sleep. They are balanced by the simple fact that a mother no longer has to check the shadows behind her. She moved toward the window, her reflection a faint ghost against the glass, and gazed down at the tranquil street. A dark sedan sat parked beneath the orange glow of a streetlight 3 blocks away. A similar car was always there, a different model in a new position each night, but its presence was a constant. The sight of it no longer sent a spike of ice through her veins. Instead, what rose up was a deep, humbling wave of gratitude. Adriano Silva had not offered her a handout. He had given her back the very breath in her lungs. And in that act, he had pieced together something broken inside himself. It might not have been redemption, but it was a piece of the powerless boy he once was, now using immense power with a clear purpose that served, in its own brutal way, as a form of grace. Juliana rested her hand on the cool window pane. Somewhere out in the sprawling city, he was navigating the darkness, enforcing a cruel set of rules. But those very rules were the reason her daughters were safe. The two of them were at the kitchen table, their crayons making soft, scratching sounds on paper. His strict code was the reason she could imagine a life beyond the next 24 hours. The long nightmare had finally broken. Daylight had returned to her world, and the man who owned the darkness had been the one to bring the light. 5 years passed, 5 Christmases came and went, and the diner was no more. A modern cafe with a sleek glass facade stood where it once had been. Juliana came to a stop on the pavement, her gloved fingers wrapped securely around two larger, much warmer hands. Chloe and Palmer, now 10 years old, were vibrating with the energy that only comes before a holiday. Their breath formed little white clouds in the frigid air. "It looks so different," Palmer observed, her voice now confident and clear, no longer the timid whisper it once was. "Everything looks different when you are not afraid anymore," Chloe added, her insight far beyond her years. Juliana gave their hands a gentle squeeze. They had made this trip every single Christmas Eve, not as a payment on a debt, but as an act of remembrance. Their existence now was wonderfully, beautifully normal. Their small apartment had transformed into a true home, overflowing with school artwork, music played too loudly, and the warm, comfortable mess of a happy family. Juliana was now the manager of the local florist shop. The festive scent of pine needles and warm cinnamon from the wreaths they had crafted that very morning still clung to the fabric of her winter coat. They continued their walk, making their way toward their new annual tradition, getting decadent hot chocolate at the fancy cafe that had replaced the source of their old fears. As they went by a newsstand, a bold headline on a business magazine snagged Juliana's attention. "Silva Enterprises, the reclusive billionaire reshaping our cities." Beneath the stark text was a grainy, long-distance photograph of a man in a dark, expensive overcoat climbing into a car. It was Adriano. He was older, the hair at his temples now streaked with silver, but his face held the same impassive, tightly controlled expression she would never forget. To the rest of the world, he was a myth shrouded in darkness, a billionaire philanthropist with rumored ties to a much grittier underworld. He was a man who commanded corporate boardrooms and, as the whispers insisted, still commanded absolute fear. To Juliana, he was the deafening silence that had once fallen over a rundown diner. He was the weight of a powerful gaze that had truly seen the depth of her suffering and had made the conscious choice not to turn away. He was the reason her two daughters understood safety as their natural right, not as some impossible miracle. "Are you all right, Mama?" Palmer asked, her eyes following her mother's stare toward the magazine cover. "I am perfect," Juliana replied, and she felt the truth of the words settle in her soul. They found a comfortable booth inside the cafe, the memory of that terrifying corner booth from 5 years ago now buried deep beneath their feet. While the girls got into a serious debate about the merits of marshmallows versus whipped cream, Juliana's mind wandered. She had never used the number he gave her. But once, about 2 years prior, a different kind of crisis had found its way to her door. It was not men making threats, but an apartment flooded by a burst pipe in the unit above. As she stood in the middle of the watery chaos, her mind racing with panic over the cost of repairs, a plain white van had pulled up outside. A team of men in unmarked work uniforms had methodically moved her furniture, extracted all the water, and completely restored her apartment in a matter of days. The foreman had only said, "Mr. Silva sends his best." The final invoice she received had only 3 words on it: paid in full, debt, 0. That was how he spoke. His language was not made of flowers or apologies, but of decisive, concrete solutions. It was protection, not charity. It was a correction. Their hot chocolates were delivered to the table, rich and steaming, crowned with magnificent peaks of whipped cream. As her girls giggled, Juliana glanced out the window at the cheerful, bustling street filled with holiday shoppers. The fear was now just a distant echo, a scar that had healed over, leaving the skin stronger than before. The man who had put an end to her terror lived on within the quiet peace of her daily life. Miles away, in a penthouse office with a commanding view of the glittering city skyline, Adriano Silva stood motionless by the window. The festive lights painting the streets below held no meaning for him. Holidays were just another block of time in the architecture of absolute control he had constructed around his life. Rico, also older now with a few more lines etched around his eyes, entered the room. "The annual report on the Molina family," he announced, setting a single piece of paper on the vast, empty desk. "All indicators are positive. Health, education, and financial stability are all strong. No external threats have been detected." Adriano did not turn around. He was already aware of the contents. The reports were a mere formality, a private ritual, he observed. "Good. She is still at the flower shop. She received a promotion. The girls are in a program for gifted children. They visited the old diner location today. It has become a cafe." A slight, almost undetectable nod was Adriano's only response. The ghost of a memory flickered in his mind. A woman in a faded olive-green jacket, her eyes holding an entire universe of desperation and fear. 2 small birds were huddled beneath her protective wings. He had not intervened to earn her gratitude. He had done it because the world operated on a set of unbreakable rules. And the most fundamental rule of all was this: the powerful are the ones who decide who gets to suffer. On that night, he had simply made the decision that her suffering would end. It was over. The act was a correction for an old personal injustice. It was a way to finally strike a balance on the ledger of his own haunted history. "Is there anything else, boss?" Rico asked, his voice respectful. "No." Adriano's voice was the same deep, quiet rumble that could command the silence of any room. "That will be all." Rico departed, leaving Adriano alone at the window, a dark silhouette against the brilliant glow of the city. His empire was enormous, built upon a foundation that was equal parts legitimate business and brutal force. He was not a good man, and he knew it. He understood the true cost of his power, a price measured in secrets and paid for in shadows. But in a small, warm cafe on the other side of town, a woman was sipping hot chocolate with her two daughters. They were laughing without constantly checking the door. They were making plans for their future without a trace of fear. They were complete. And for a man who had dedicated his entire life to building impenetrable fortresses, that single piece of knowledge was a unique and quiet victory. He had been unable to save his own mother. He could never erase the shame of the boy he was or the sins of the man he had become. But he had managed to stop the vicious cycle, just once, for one family. On a single Christmas Eve, he had become the wall that held back the darkness. This was not redemption. Redemption was an idea for simpler men, for men with cleaner souls than his. This was something different entirely. It was a testament. It was proof that even within the coldest of hearts, and with the most calculated application of power, a line could be drawn in the sand. It showed that mercy could be used as a weapon, and that providing protection could be the most ruthless and absolute decision of all. Outside Juliana's cafe, soft flakes of snow began to fall, wrapping the city in a quiet white blanket. It covered the old scars and the painful memories of running. It covered the ghost of hunger. The snow covered everything, creating the illusion of a world made new again. Juliana gathered her girls, their cheeks rosy and flushed with warmth and happiness. As they all stepped out into the sparkling, magical night, she did not look back over her shoulder. She looked ahead, toward their home, and toward their future. The night that had once started with abject terror had now concluded with an entirely different legacy. It was not a legacy of debt or of violence, but one of quiet, unshakable safety. It was a gift from a monster who was intimately familiar with what monsters do, and who chose, for one critical moment, to be something else entirely. On that night, the Mafia boss did not destroy a life. He brought a nightmare to its final end. And in the peaceful silence that came after, a family remembered how to truly live. Thank you for staying with this story until the very last word. This story reminds us of a truth that is easy to forget. Real strength is not measured by the power you hold, but by how you choose to use it. Sometimes the people who save us are the ones we least expect, and sometimes one single act of compassion can rewrite the entire future of a family. Never lose faith, even in your darkest hour, because help may already be on its way. If this story touched your heart, do me a small favor. Hit that like button, leave a comment rating this story from 1 to 10, and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you have not already, tap that subscribe button so you never miss another story. Your support means more than you know. Now tap the next video on your screen. I promise another powerful journey is waiting for you. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories and valuable life lessons to our audience.